we're going to stick to Texas because it doesn't get any better in Texas. But this is an interesting story because even though, as I mentioned a bit ago, they have passed a law allowing trained chaplains to take the place, I'm sorry, untrained chaplains, they will allow them to take the place of trained social workers. That's happening in Texas. They've actually tried to pass a bill to get the 10 commandments in every classroom. That one didn't work, but they tried to do it. Um, and they also want to force schools, as I just told you, to force instruction on the Bible, whatever the hell that means. It's not enough for them. And here's the story that I wanted to get to. Last year, those Republicans in the Texas legislature, they passed a bill that cost over $730 million over the next 2 years alone, basically telling the Texas Education Agency to develop instructional materials. And here's what the issue is. A lot of districts across the country, what do you think they need? Even whoops, sorry about that. I kicked my own platform here. What do you think a lot of districts do to get textbooks? What they do is they say, well, we've been using this history textbook for several years, but it's still good. It still tells the right story. The books are in good shape. We'll keep them. Or they say, these books have been around for a while. There's a lot of new information over the past 10 years that we need to teach students. Maybe we need to purchase different textbooks or a digital textbook or something like that. This is true across the board over different subjects. And it's really costly when you do something like that. And if you're buying new textbooks, it takes the input of teachers and administrators and things like that. A lot of low-income districts do not have the money to buy new textbooks. It's almost a sad cliche at this point that if you go to a poorer school, like their books are stuck together with masking tape. They were published in like the 1940s. It's depressing because students deserve better and more recent, books. It's easier to learn from. And so Texas did something that I think deserves some credit, which is they said, let's spend some money and make our own stuff, and then teachers can just use that. Let's do it in-house, and we'll make sure it aligns with the state standards, and then districts can use it. In fact, we'll go one better. We will give districts an incentive of $40 to $60 per kid if you adopt our new program. So it's really hard to say no to. All right. So that's what Texas legislature decided to do a couple years ago. What happened this week is that they put out publicly a draft of these new lessons because they've been working for years getting these lessons put together from kindergarten through like fifth grade to start from. And I wanted to show you some of the stuff in the English, language arts, and reading material for students in grades K through 5. And the public now that Texas has published this stuff, the public can weigh in. There will be like a few months before this material is finalized. And what's disturbing about this material, can you guess? Turns out there's a lot of Jesus in it. And there are so many examples of this. There's a news website, an education-focused website called The 74, which stands for 74 million. I can't remember what that's in reference to. Maybe the number of kids in school. I don't know. Anyway, but this media outlet, The 74, they got access. Well, I mean, they looked through all the slides and they said there's a lot of Jesus in here. I'm just going to show you two examples of what's going on here. And I wanted to show you one part of it first, which is this right here. Guess who put together this curricula? Check this out right here from the 74. While largely hidden from public view, the redesign sparked behind-the-scenes debate long before its release. When a leading curriculum publisher, more on them in a second, balked at the state's request to infuse its offerings with biblical content, Texas officials turned to other vendors. They include, oh my God, for the second time tonight, they include conservative Christian Hillsdale College in Michigan and the right-leaning Texas Public Policy Foundation, which, by the way, supported that effort to force the 10 Commandments in every classroom. These are the people putting together this curriculum. Like, of course it's going to be disturbing, right? So the 74 lists a bunch of examples of this. I'm going to just show you two to try to convince you that what they are doing is really disturbing. In the way they're going about this, it's so sneaky, it's so devious, it's really annoying. Okay, here's one example. In the material that was made for fifth graders, there is a whole unit about, I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. There's a whole unit for fifth graders called Juneteenth and Beyond. And I don't like the idea of Texas Republicans or conservatives deciding what kids need to know about Juneteenth, but that is one of the units. And I'm glad, like, kids need to be taught what Juneteenth is. And in that curriculum, they are told, fifth graders are told, they have to read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. And I'm going to show you, like, if you've never read it, you should. I mean, a fifth grader can read it. It's not short. This goes on for like 6 pages or so on this document. But if you're not familiar with it, the letter from Birmingham jail is something Martin Luther King wrote after he was arrested during a nonviolent protest. And when he was sitting in that jail, he read some newspaper piece where several white clergy members were basically saying, hey, black people, be patient, fight racism through the courts, stop it with all the protesting. And Martin Luther King is like, no, we're not stopping. We're doing the right thing. And in fact, history is on our side because throughout history, protests, nonviolent protests, have carried the day. So how dare you tell us to sit back and wait our turn, because it's not going to happen unless we force their hand. So that's what the letter says. Fascinating to read. Famously in this letter, Martin Luther King says, "For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear," he says, "of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never." Powerful words. He also quotes the line, "Justice too long delayed is justice denied," which I'm sure you heard this week as well for reasons. But then he says one thing in the middle of this essay. I'm looking at page 3 of the document I was looking at here, but I'm going to point you just to the middle of this, because look at this one little section in the middle of nowhere right there. And he says, because he is a reverend, he can make religious references. Of course, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was seen sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar, because a higher moral law was involved. All right. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks before submitting to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. Okay, powerful words. Now, here's where it gets sneaky. If I went to the Wikipedia page for Letter from Birmingham Jail, and they talk about the summaries and themes and all the stuff you're supposed to take away from this letter, you know what doesn't show up anywhere in this article? Those Bible references I just mentioned. Why? Because it's a random sentence. Martin Luther King Jr. is making a reference to some biblical characters for reasons I'll tell you in a second, but it's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. All he's doing is making a larger point that a lot of people have done civil disobedience to get the outcome they wanted. Now, in case you're wondering, what is that reference all about? Those 3 guys and the king. In the book of Daniel, those 3 characters, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they were thrown into a furnace because they were not bowing down to an image of the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar II. But when the king looked to see them burned up, guess what he saw? He saw 4 figures, the 3 dudes, and one person who looked like a son of God. And basically, those three men were unharmed. And the lesson we're supposed to take away from that is you don't worship false idols. You have faith in God. And guess what? Even when they tried to destroy you, God was protecting you. And Martin Luther King Jr. was saying, hey, those guys practiced a form of civil disobedience. They did not bow down to that idol. They worshiped God and they were saved. But isn't that civil disobedience too? Now, again, I want to repeat that is not a big takeaway from the letter because that is a point Martin Luther King Jr. makes over and over and over. You don't need to know that Bible reference to make sense of it. But what they are doing in Texas is they're saying, of all the things kids need to learn from letter from Birmingham jail, you know what they really need to learn about? It's that Bible story. All right. So here's an example of what I mean. There's a section, there's a short essay that kids can respond to their reading. A short constructed response reading question. Read the question carefully, then write your answer. Why did Martin Luther King Jr. reference the story of Daniel in his letter from Birmingham jail? Support your answer with evidence from the text. Like, they don't have any other short answer responses in the curriculum. Not in this unit. But of all the things they want kids to write about, it's why do you think he mentioned those characters? And in order to make sense of those characters, you got to know the story. How are they going to know the story? Well, guess what? In a reader that they provided for students in this draft curriculum, they spend so much damn time talking about this. Look at this. A whole section on references from Daniel. Look at the bottom here. Look at this part right here. They're saying, Martin Luther King Jr. was a reverend. It would have been familiar to Christians and Jews who read his letter. To understand King, one must also understand his religious references. Like, no, if you want to understand King, you don't need to know the Bible references, certainly not to like ancillary characters that appeared in a book most people have not read. But guess what? Texas is helping you out because they now go through the entire story of that story in the book of Daniel. Oh, look, the destruction of Jerusalem. Oh, look, the Babylonian Empire. Oh, look, here's what it said. Oh, Daniel chooses faith over temptation. Got to teach kids about that. Oh, look, there's the king's idol that those three men were supposed to worship. Oh, look, they were supposed to be burned alive, but they weren't because they had their faith. This goes on for so long. Oh my God. It's like 6 pages talking about this Bible story. Why? Because it's a unit on Juneteenth and they really don't want to talk about Juneteenth and they don't really want to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. They definitely in Texas do not want kids understanding what racism looks like because then they would see it all around them. So instead, they're like, you know what we should talk about in the letter from Birmingham jail? It's the Bible reference. And let's spend a lot of time making sure kids get it. Martin Luther King Jr. makes so many references in that entire book. He references Socrates and Aristotle. He references Brown versus Board of Education, that Supreme Court case. He references Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. But what do they focus on in this curriculum? It's the Bible reference. When the 74 asked a guy who is in charge of all this, what is up with that? Why would that be the thing you want kids to focus on? This is what he said. If you don't know who Nebuchadnezzar is, you don't know what King is talking about. How do you make sure that you can unlock in the minds of our kids their ability to wrestle with ideas that have surfaced in great works of literature? It's by teaching them this stuff. Like, I want to go back to this top thing he said because it's insane. If you don't know who Nebuchadnezzar is, you don't know what King is talking about. No, you don't have to know who that biblical king is in order to make sense of racism is bad. You don't. It is unnecessary. You can learn about this stuff in other ways. You don't need it. You can absolutely figure it out. But you see what they're doing here. They're using a minor reference that Martin Luther King Jr. made to the Bible because he's a reverend. He knew his Bible stories. and they're blowing it up out of proportion in order to centralize it during a discussion of Martin Luther King Jr. So that's weird. It shouldn't be happening. By the way, elsewhere in that same unit, it suggests that many racists, it suggests that many civil rights leaders and their allies were motivated by their Christian faith to march along with King and to do what Martin Luther King wanted them to do. They were anti racist. You know what they don't talk about at all in the curriculum? The fact that a whole bunch of racists were also motivated by their Christian faith. Just look up the KKK. How do you think that one got started? Okay. So that's one example of how this new curriculum that Texas is offering for free with an incentive to all these districts is just putting the Bible front and center. Here's another example that I found really, I don't know if it's funny or disturbing. It might be both. Um, there is another unit in here. I want to find the exact part. I'll come back to it in a second. There is a lesson for second graders, and it's called Fighting for the Cause. And that's a whole unit which is supposed to introduce students to ordinary people who stood up for what they believed in and who fought for a cause even when faced with immeasurable odds, which sounds wonderful. Like you are teaching kids who may not be familiar with these names about people like Jackie Robinson, the first Black player in Major League Baseball, and Rosa Parks for obvious reasons. So, like, these are people who did something really heroic and courageous. And it was hard for them to do it because there was a lot of backlash, but they did it anyway. And we ought to know who they are and study them. Very important. I'm right there with them. They also include people like William Penn, the founder of the namesake of Pennsylvania, who fought for like religious freedom, and William Wilberforce, who is an abolitionist. Very important. And I'm glad they are studying that. And they actually go through like 8 or 9 different people like that throughout history who have fought the good fight. They have a couple Latina freedom fighters in there as well. And then, because this is the point I'm trying to make, they also include one other character. They include one other person, and it is Queen Esther from the Bible. And this is an example. This is the teacher's edition of the document. By the way, someone is making a comment. We're going to turn to this when I get to the Q&A in a second here, that kids should learn some basics about the Bible. Fair point. I'm going to get to that. But I want to show you what the teacher's edition says here. Check for understanding, teachers. These are questions you can ask your students. For what cause did William Wilberforce fight for during his lifetime? Answer, abolition, ending slavery. Look, I'm going to skip ahead. What right did William Penn believe was necessary for all people to have in the colony of Pennsylvania? Religious freedom. What action did Rosa Parks take that helped to bring about change in the South? We have the answer. She refused to give up her seat on the bus, which helped spark the civil rights movement. Fine. And then here, which group of people did Queen Esther save from a plan to destroy them? The Jewish people of Persia. Here's the problem with that. That's a Bible character, and historians would argue she never existed. They have all these actual heroes who did courageous things, and then they stuck in a Bible character because they found an opening. And if there's one moral of this whole story, it's that if they found an opening, they're going to shove the Bible in there. Here's my favorite aspect of this. There is a document that Texas also released with a bunch of images. Hey, teachers, you're doing this unit? Here's some images of all these people so you could show your students because that's important, right? And in here, I'm going to show you some of these. Like, who do they have here? Here's an image. Who is that? William Penn, probably. I don't know if that one's Penn or Wilberforce, but you have that. We have some other freedom fighters in there. This is the civil rights. Sorry, it's upside down there, but you get the idea. Jackie Robinson. Okay, I'm going to scroll back up here because in the middle of all this, they just have this image. There's Queen Esther. She like sat for a portrait or something. And here's the thing, she did not pose for a portrait. That's a painting from like when is that from? That is from 1878. It's from an artist, Edwin Long. He did not have her sit down for that painting. He drew it from his imagination because she never existed. This is the equivalent of putting the Coca-Cola Santa Claus in this document and saying, "We know what Santa looked like because here's the painting of it." It's like, no, dude, that's part of a marketing campaign for a brand. What are you doing? That's not really her. That's just some artist's depiction of her because she didn't exist. What are they doing here? Doesn't make any sense. And even in the documents for teachers, they are like, what should you say when you show kids these images? Well, look at the teacher notes for this image of Queen Esther. Kids, you're going to read a story from the Bible about Queen Esther, a Jewish woman who was chosen by the king of Persia to be queen. An advisor convinced the king to destroy the Jews, but the king did not know this would include his own queen. You will read about what Queen Esther did to fight for her people. Like, oh my God, what is going on here? By the way, if you're wondering who is Queen Esther, the Bible says Queen Esther saved the Jewish people by foiling her husband's plot to eradicate them. And that's why theoretically she's included in this unit, but that story never happened. That's the whole point. Like, yeah, she is important in that version of the story, but that story did not happen. So why are we including it here? The point is, throughout these lessons, Christianity is treated as fact. Why are we doing that? The Bible's characters are not referred to as characters, but as real people whose stories were told in the Bible. That's disturbing. I'll show you one more and then I'll move on from here. There is a 5th grade lesson on the Renaissance, and they have a section on the famous Renaissance artists. And Leonardo da Vinci is in that mix because, of course, he is. He should be. Kids need to learn about who he was. Which painting do you think they spend time on when it comes to Leonardo da Vinci? Was it the Mona Lisa? It is not the Mona Lisa. No, of course not. Because again, what's the moral? If they could shove the Bible in, they will. So they spend all their time really hammering home the Last Supper. And this is where it gets almost comically hilarious. Here is the teacher's notes again for this section. We're going to learn about the Last Supper. Leonardo was kept busy on all kinds of projects. Did he ever find time to paint? Yes, he did. And let's talk about the Last Supper. Look at this last paragraph here. The Bible explains that Jesus knew that after this meal, sorry, I'm going to zoom in here. After this meal, he would be arrested, put on trial, and killed. Let us read the story in the book of Matthew to see for ourselves what unfolded during the supper. That's page 22. Look at the notes here. Have students read page 22 silently and continue through the second paragraph of page 25. What do you think goes on page 23, 24, and the beginning of 25? Let us see. Well, if I scroll down here a little bit, oh, we have the painting of the Last Supper. Sorry, it's backwards here. Come on, internet, move. Ah, yes, they're looking at the Last Supper. Fine. And then, oh my God, the next page that students have to read. Let's just toss in some Bible verses. The part about the Last Supper. Yes, in the biblical narrative, here's what Jesus did, blah, blah, blah. Something about the Last Supper. This goes on for a while. And at the end of page 25, or the second paragraph, what does this say? It goes on for a while. You get my point here. Like, it's one thing to say the Last Supper is based on a biblical story, but they're going so far beyond it and saying, like, no, that's really all you need to know about the Last Supper. That's the big thing. And I want to go back to the point this commenter made earlier about, like, well, shouldn't kids know these references? And I think the answer to an extent is yes. I am all for cultural literacy. I think there is this shared, if you're an American, there is a shared cultural knowledge, and the more students know about it, the better. There are certain idioms we use that don't translate over well that kids should understand. There are certain references to things in American history, pop culture. And yes, Bible stories that show up in song lyrics and pop culture. Like, it is hard to make sense of classic literature or even song lyrics if you don't know the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark. Like, I can understand, you can make an objective argument for why kids need to know those stories. Because if they are going to read, books, literature down the line, classic literature for sure, it helps to know those references. So I am not saying kids cannot be taught about the Bible. What they are doing in this curriculum that will be given to public school districts throughout the state if they want it is that they're shoving the Bible in as if that's the main reason kids need to know about these things. They're trying to turn a, a public school unit into a Sunday school lesson. That's the problem we're having here. And it's also important that we say, like, if you want to know the Last Supper, guess what? That was based on a Bible passage. It's one thing if you're going to say that, but then it is imperative to tell students not that it comes from the Bible, but that, yeah, the Bible's a work of fiction. You got to be objective about this. You can't treat it like it's a historical document. Maybe you don't say the Bible is fiction or something. Maybe that goes too far in the other direction. But you got to treat it objectively and not as historical fact. And there is a lot of historical fact vibes every time they do this. And also, if you're going to teach them cultural literacy, or in the name of cultural literacy, you're going to introduce them to these Bible topics, you got to focus on the biggest Bible stories, not like the C plot characters that inhabit the Bible just for the sake of telling their stories. Like, I know Christians will be like, Queen Esther is important. She's important in the Jewish culture as well. But as far as pop culture goes, Queen Esther is not Taylor Swift. She is not that important that everyone needs to know who she is. I don't get why they're wasting time with all this. So, given all that, when they asked a professor, when the reporters at the 75 asked a professor about like all this stuff, here's what this professor said, a religious studies guy. It is reasonable to devote some attention to the Bible, and state education standards across the nation often require such attention, said this religious studies professor at Southern Methodist University. The problem, of course, is that sometimes the legitimate reason of cultural literacy is used as a smokescreen to hide religious and ideological agendas. That hits it on the nail. Sorry, I said that totally wrong, but that nails it. That gets it exactly right. Instead of just teaching them the basic Bible story so that they can make sense of literature or paintings or whatever, they are using it as a way to do Sunday school sermons to these kids. Here's another thing, and I brought this up in the last section. State officials were actually working with a different company to put together this curriculum. And the company's name is Amplify. Well, state officials asked Amplify to provide a lesson on the story of Esther and suggested a unit on the book of Exodus, according to someone who worked for Amplify. And while it had previously tweaked its curriculum for other states, this spokesperson said the company had never been asked to add biblical material. And when it suggested inserting content from other world religions, Texas was like, no. There was not much appetite for a variety of wisdom texts, she said. There was much more of an appetite for the tie to traditional Christian texts. And that is why Amplify, this company, said, we cannot work with you. And that's why Texas began working with those right-wing groups. Isn't that insane? By the way, Texas then ditched Amplify, yes, and began to work with those groups. This is what they developed. There was one thing I was actually really surprised by in this article by the 74, which is that they already, in Texas, they already allow school districts to teach a Bible in schools or Bible as literature elective class. Like, students can already take that if their districts offer it. So why are they working so hard to shove this into kids' faces? And this is new information to me from the 74 because they've been allowing those theoretically objective Bible as literature classes since 2007. But get this, turns out those classes are super unpopular, A 2007 state law allows school districts to offer high school electives on the Bible. Demand has been extremely low, however. According to the Texas Education Agency, just over 1,200 of the state's 1.7 million high school students took the course this year. That's a drop in the bucket. And of those 1,200 kids, you're probably seeing clumps of kids taking it in like very Christian areas, not like one offs in 1,200 different school districts, but like a few school districts have a lot of kids taking it, and that's it. Like, no one's taking this course. So their plan to get religion in school in 2007, it failed. No one wants to do it. So now they found this other way to go around the law and get religion into schools a different way. And again, I think what's the most disturbing thing is what are they offering school districts for this? They said, uh, Texas said to school districts, once we finalize this, if you use our curriculum, not only are we going to give it to you for free, we'll give you an incentive of between $40 to $60 per student to take this curriculum and use it. And if you are a cash strapped school district, how could you possibly say no to that? You're not going to spend money on textbooks when Texas is giving you money to use the state approved curriculum that happens to have a lot of Jesus in it and a lot of Bible in it. That's so devious and cruel's the wrong word, but like they will always find a way to shove Christianity into the government however they can. And in this case, it's Christianity into schools. Nothing they're doing is theoretically illegal because they're not proselytizing, but you see what they're doing here. They're not doing the same thing to the Quran. They're not doing the same thing to other holy books that are popular around the world. They don't need kids to learn anything but the basics of other religions. But when it comes to the Bible, you got to drill down in depth to get to those other characters. It's wild. Okay, I'll get to questions here. Why can't we can't focus long enough to read a short primary text by Dr. King, but we could support even longer tangential fiction pawned off as background material. That tracks. Yeah, no kidding. And you know what? If Letter from Birmingham Jail is too long for you, fifth graders, there are so many other things you could read that are just as important that are not nearly as long. And yet, what are they doing? They're like, let's read some Bible verses. You know what kids love? It's Sunday school. I don't get it. I don't get how they think that's going to be captivating, but it's so devious. I don't know a better word for it. This is why I left Texas. I'm a Heritage Museum art educator, and the politics around sharing history gets in the way of just telling people what happened. No kidding. Like, just let the experts, people who study history, who teach history, let them tell the public schools, like, hey, this is what we feel children need to know in order to have a good understanding of the subject area where we are experts in. And instead of getting those people to make these decisions, they're going to a Christian college in Michigan and saying, how do we make sure the Bible gets in everything we are doing? And by the way, I mentioned those examples to you during the segment. There are plenty of other examples. There's a whole section on King Solomon of the Bible. There are other biblical references throughout this thing. These are not the only ones. Is this actually going to be taught in public schools? Yeah. I mean, that's the entire purpose of creating this curriculum. It's to give public schools a free curriculum that they could use while dangling some money in front of every school district saying, use it. Here, take some cash. Here's a briefcase of cash. And this stuff is all online. We've made it easy for you to use. And it aligns with state standards. So districts are like, well, it does our job for us. It's great. But again, going back to what I was talking about earlier with like the Florida civics education treatment, there are some teachers who will understand what's going on here. And they will find a way to educate their students in a way that is solid and defensible. But a lot of teachers do not realize what's going on here. So they're going to follow suit and they will indoctrinate their kids with this stuff. And, that 10 years from now, there's some Texan kid going to college somewhere and they will be saying like, oh yeah, I remember a letter from Birmingham jail. It's that letter Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about Nebuchadnezzar. And oh yeah, freedom fighters, I remember them. Queen Esther. She's just like Rosa Parks. It's like, what are you talking about, child who doesn't know anything in our college? What grade level is this text? The Queen Esther one I was showing you is for second graders. The Martin Luther King Birmingham jail reference, that was for fifth graders. But the material they released publicly is K through 5. But I believe they're developing it for K through 12 in the long run. But again, what happens now is there's a couple months where they will take public input when it comes to any changes, and then they'll finalize it and make it available for schools. I don't know if it's going to go into effect this next school year, but it might. And yet they cut art and music and a number of other programs that would have much higher attendance. Man, no kidding. I'm right there with you. They focus on this stuff. And who needs music? Who needs art? Don't worry, we'll teach you about art. Let's read our Bible verses about the Last Supper. Yeah, it's really disturbing. Kids deserve better than that. It's just too bad Texas lawmakers don't like the kids in Texas as much as the rest of us do. We think they deserve better. Just finished Black History AF. Who is that by? That sounds fascinating. And good discussion about civil disobedience with regard to Martin Luther King Jr. Recommended. Thanks, Mark. I don't know who wrote Black History AF, but that sounds fantastic. I love the title. We'll find out. We'll get the answer to that in a second. I haven't read the book of Daniel because Evan hasn't read it to me yet. I don't know if I'm going to get to that one. I'm done with the Revelation series. I'm going to take a break from those Bible readings. You'll never believe this. They kind of get boring after a while. I try to make it interesting, but it's hard. Any other comments here? We're going to, here we go. The answer. Who wrote Black History AF? It is Michael Harriot. Thanks, Den, for that.